I'm sure, Camilla, you've been in love, that there is at this moment an affair of the heart going on.
I have been in love with no one, and never shall, unless it should be with you. Darling, I live in you, and you would die for me. I love you so.
In the year 1610, the Countess Elizabeth Bathory was imprisoned for allegedly killing hundreds of young women and bathing in their blood. This tale of serial murders quickly passed into myth, and in the 1800s, combined with various Eastern European vampire myths, went on to inspire the tale of the first lesbian vampire, Carmilla. Predating the publication of Dracula by 25 years, Sheridan Le Fanu's novella Carmilla tells the tale of a young woman named Laura who, at the age of about 17 or 18, lives practically all alone in her father's castle with absolutely no one else for miles, except her many servants. But when a carriage crashes nearby, a delicate young woman is entrusted to Laura's father for the next few months. This girl's name is Carmilla, and she is tall, slender, beautiful. However, this is a gothic horror novel, and there is a dark undercurrent to the sweet teenage love story. It turns out Carmilla is a monster, a vampire, who is draining Laura's blood night after night and killing other girls in the area too. Luckily, they figured this all out before it's too late and they can decapitate her. This is the OG lesbian vampire story and one of the defining works of vampire literature in general. It influenced Bram Stoker's Dracula and features a lot of tropes that define the genre. And while her portrayal isn't entirely unsympathetic, it's very explicit that her vampirism isn't just a metaphor for sexuality. Le Fanu makes sure we understand that these romantic advancements were a sign of Carmilla's monstrosity. She seduces an innocent victim and is ultimately destroyed. Carmilla went on to be featured in dozens of film adaptations and influenced a whole genre of lesbian vampire films. She's been called a monster, she's been called a feminist icon, she was an aristocrat, a sexy schoolgirl, she starred in everything from black and white film to anime. So let's have a look at the evolution of the lesbian vampire trope in film. The first film adaptation of Carmilla was the 1932 film Vampire, released the year after Dracula made his official cinematic debut. However, they made a point to remove any hint of romance between the characters, including making the vampire an old woman instead of a beautiful young one, because as we all know, lesbians can't be old. The motion picture production code of the 1930s to the 1960s put a lot of restrictions on what kind of content was appropriate to be shown in feature films. This included sexual perversion, which, as we all know, extends to basically anything I get up to on the weekend. This meant that for decades, Hollywood was shockingly tame. Dracula never actually bites his victims, he just hovers near their necks. So a saucier adaptation of Carmilla wouldn't materialise for another 28 years, but in the meantime, the Dracula franchise was taking off. The first sequel to Dracula appeared in 1936 in the form of Dracula's Daughter. This film picks up right where Dracula left off and follows the tale of his eponymous daughter who struggles to suppress her unholy desire for the blood of the innocent. Dracula's Daughter had major lesbian overtones from the start of production, so the Production Code Administration kept a close eye on the development of the script. In a scene where Dracula's daughter is supposed to pounce on a young woman under the pretense of painting her in a birthday suit, the PCA demanded that the scene be changed so that the woman is clearly still clothed, and there's a clear follow-up scene explaining that no naughty things happened between the two women, just good old-fashioned wholesome blood drinking. But that wasn't all that was cut. The character wasn't allowed to be interested in straight sex either. Any sexual desire she feels has to be translated directly into vampiric hunger. She was a tragic figure, really. More emotionally complex than her father, for sure. She hated her need for blood, and the film follows her attempts to resist it, basically seeking conversion therapy. Carmilla only returned to her frightening lesbian ways in 1960's Blood and Roses. This film is very loosely based on the novella, set in the present day of the time, and is the first explicitly queer adaptation of the story. Blood and Roses was part of a wave of Italian and French vampire films of the 60s which didn't have to follow the same strict censorship rules as Hollywood films, and were thus filled with lesbian undertones, BDSM, and brutal violence. Blood and Roses is an early installment of what would become a boom of erotic lesbian vampire films with nipples abound. 1966 saw the relaxation of the Film Production Code and the adoption of the MPAA rating system, which meant that there was a lot more freedom in what kind of films could be made. You could make something with a rating for all viewers, or you could produce content for a far more adult audience. Filmmakers took advantage of that, and they especially liked using supernatural genres like vampire films to see how far they could push the boundaries. They took inspiration from the earlier European BDSM lesbian films and tapped into the growing popularity of softcore adult cinema to take the former lesbian undertones of vampire films and make vampires explicitly, unambiguously erotic and lesbian. They didn't necessarily need vampirism as a stand-in for sexuality anymore. It could be, to some degree, made explicit. The lesbian vampire of the late 60s and the 70s was no longer the melancholy, self-loathing vampire of Dracula's daughter. The 70s lesbian vampire embodied sex and desperately sought out her own vampire bride. The films that defined this trend came from Hammer Studios and were a part of the Karnstein trilogy based on the Carmilla novella. They belong to a genre called sexploitation, low-budget, independently produced features which compensate for their lack of brand name talent and production value with sensational subject matter, attention-grabbing promotions, and satination booking intended to generate profit in a quick theatrical run. They sometimes starred Playboy models and were in large part just an excuse to look at tartars and women making out, but they also embodied men's anxieties about the sexual revolution and the second wave of feminism. Maybe that's why we got to see so many nipples, you know? The feminist vampires burnt all their bras. Alas, as fun as it sounds, just as in the Carmilla novella, there was almost always a price to pay for this. Seemingly sexually liberated from the restraints of Hollywood, the lesbian vampire film appears to allow for women's desire, but always exacts its punishment. The masculine subject can accept the image of a woman's pleasure only on the condition that, having constructed it, he may inscribe himself within it and thus reappropriate it, even at the cost of her destruction. The 60s and 70s were the golden age of the lesbian vampire film, with European and American B-movies eager to copy the Hammer trilogy. There were more lesbians in film than ever before, and in her book Vampires and Violets, Lesbians in Film, author Andrea Weiss calls lesbian vampires the most persistent depiction of lesbianism in the history of film. However, they come with a heavy dose of the male gaze. And I don't mean with a Y, male gaze, with a Z. The 1970 adaptation of Carmilla and the first film in the Hammer trilogy, The Vampire Lovers, is actually really quite faithful to the novella.
I want you to love me for all your life.
Directed and written by men, this film lends further to the male gaze by changing the perspective of the story. The novella was told in first person by Laura, but this version follows Carmilla and a mysterious man in black who follows her and watches her drain the blood of her victims, quite literally embodying the male gaze through which the male audience can place himself in the scenes. The Vampire Lovers also introduces an interesting dynamic which went on to become the staple of lesbian vampire films and which Weiss calls the bisexual love triangle. This trope features a human couple, a man and a woman, and a lesbian vampire who is here to seduce the woman. The man in this dynamic, which is really more of a V shape than a triangle, represents goodness, the church, family, social order, and the lesbian represents evil and bosoms. While it would be reductive to explain the former as solely the product of the latter, the emergence of the lesbian vampire in this period does, in some measure, symbolize this threat from contemporaneous second-wave feminist and gay liberation movements in the 70s. The lesbian challenges the social order by subverting the stereotype of helpless women that ruled the screens before that. She doesn't need a man romantically or financially, as vampires are often wealthy aristocrats and thus financially independent. And while these films may take inspiration from softcore films, unlike their inspiration, which centers on male pleasure and the money shot, these vampire films center on the oral consummation of female same-sex desire, metaphorically rendered as blood-sucking. Weiss also points out that her pointy teeth give the lesbian vampire the power to be the one who penetrates skin, and evoke the images of vagina dentata. YouTube, please don't demonetize me. This is a serious film analysis. We have to talk about the vagina teeth. It just... The typical formula of the bisexual love triangle in lesbian vampire films follows as such. The vampire's arrival disturbs the natural order of things and induces anxiety in both the characters and the spectators. In the main part of the film which follows, the natural order is disturbed and the vampire takes over. She seduces the human lady and lures her away from her man. The bisexual victim is often an essential feature to these stories. The plot must revolve around her temptation. She must be pulled away from the natural world of heterosexuality and tempted by the preternatural lesbian desire. It's all about her internal struggle between a split self, in which the stiflingly straight self is inevitably seduced by the infinitely more enticing, immortal queer self. Of course, it wouldn't do for her to fall to temptation, and she's usually expected to return happily to heterosexual normality, and the vampire lesbian is killed. But that capacity for bisexual desire is essential to her journey and her vulnerability as the victim. As Barbara Creed puts it, there's an implication that, given a choice, women might prefer the embrace of their own sex, and in indulging in that desire, she's drawn away from her proper gender role. The lesbian vampire often uses her beauty and her femininity as a disguise and a weapon. Douglas Brody writes, Vampire Lovers is about the disarming power of female beauty, particularly of the sort that Western culture posits as innocent in appearance, causing the would-be crusader to momentarily set aside caution in adhering to the ancient code of chivalry. At least that is until she reveals her true nature. Such behaviour is exposed as a dangerous anchor to an earlier age. As modernity approaches, women can no longer be assumed to embody what they seem. Damn sexy feminists. This is depicted in The Vampire Lovers in the opening sequence, in which a vampire hunter is disarmed by the beauty of the vampire he's about to slay. The men in this story must overcome the titillation of these vampires, indeed, for a whole trilogy of nipple-filled sequels. Unfortunately, Ingrid Pitt didn't want to come back for another one, so Carmilla is played by a different actress in each film, and the continuity doesn't really hold up between them, despite all being made within only a couple of years of each other. Once Carmilla's new head has been attached to her body to resurrect the character for the sequel, it is revealed that she herself was indeed never a lesbian at all, but something far more mythological than even the vampire: the bisexual. Carmilla is the origin of the lesbian vampire trope. She was the first, she's a lesbian icon, she's a queen, we stan, absolute ledge. But as hinted at as far back as Dracula's Daughter, these characters exhibited not only the absolute terror and horror of pure lesbianism, but their relationships with men have another origin. The femme fatale is the trope of a beautiful, mysterious woman who uses her feminine wiles and wits to ensnare her victims, usually a man. The femme fatale, sometimes called the vamp, is not necessarily supernatural in any way, but embodies cultural anxieties about women's independence, including her sexual independence and her influence over men. The femme fatale was a popular trope in early film that can be traced all the way back to its first depiction in the 1913 film The Vampire, which the New York Dramatic Mirror described as a film about a beautiful woman who loves destroying men. These early vamps and femme fatales were not supernatural. They embodied evil sexuality. Theda Bara, an actress who often portrayed them, said that her biggest fans were women because they saw her act out their revenge fantasies. Carmilla is a kind of femme fatale, but at the same time embodies the lesbophobic fear that women might just not need men for anything at all. A vampire without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. This feature, combined with the traditional straight interpretations of the femme fatale, leaves us with frighteningly fluid interpretations of the vampire myth. So as we see, beginning with Dracula's Daughter, the femme fatale lesbian vampire of the silver screen is quite horrifyingly, dreadfully, even fatally bisexual. I suppose we call them the lesbian vampire because of what they represent. Paula Graham said that female power is often symbolized by lesbianism. These vampires may want women, they may want men, but the straight men who usually create these characters see them as the lesbian threat. Her bisexuality is frightening in that she disrupts the social order through her sexual and social independence. One could argue that she was less a figure depicting lesbianism, she was never coded as lesbian, than she was a signifier for the instability of the heterosexual social order. Indeed, that particular image of the lesbian vampire represented a displacement of anxiety over the potential for the lesbian feminist movement gaining enormous momentum from second-wave feminism and the aftermath of Stonewall to unmask heterosexuality and reveal it as tenuous, unstable, and not at all as natural to human social organisation as it purported to be. Bisexuality, as well as lesbianism, lends to this instability of the heterosexual order. Social structures are dismantled by the fluidity of these characters who you can never quite pin down. You can never be certain whose side she's on. The typical vampire and her victim lack the lesbian verisimilitude that would enable them to pass as lesbians. They flirt with men and dress and undress to appeal to male desire. To many bisexual women, this idea that her femininity is simply for the male gaze might sound familiar. Bisexuals often pass as straight, and their desire, their relationships, their existence is exploited for heterosexual male consumption. To Andrea Weiss, the lesbian vampire doesn't pass as a true lesbian, regardless of her relationships with women. She's neither straight nor truly lesbian, suspicious to both the straight and lesbian viewer. In her analysis, Weiss only ever talks about these vampire characters as lesbians or their failure to truly represent lesbians. In doing so, she falls into the trap that queer theory so often does, seeing monosexuality as the only essential state of being and not considering a bisexual interpretation. They're never bisexuals, just rubbish lesbians. By not distinguishing between lesbian and bisexual characters, she may do a disservice to both lesbian and bi readers and leaves a blind spot in their interpretation. For example, in Daughters of Darkness, a vampire version of Elizabeth Bathory,
Countess Elizabeth Bathory,
lusts after a newlywed couple. This vampire represents a threat to the holy institution of marriage itself, because their temptations are so often adulterous. Witness their particular craving for newlyweds. Vampires violate the social and marital order that binds female desire within heterosexual marriage. De-romanticizing the bond that sustains heteropatriarchy, these films depict marriage not as blissful, but as ineffectual or even perverse. Furthermore, the male half of the married couple in Daughters of Darkness is a sadist and also implied to be bisexual with a secret male partner. Weiss, however, interprets the vampire as a lesbian and the sadist husband as a gay man. The author of The B Word, Bisexuality in Contemporary Film and Television, Maria Sanfilippo, states that bisexuality remains the blind spot of queer formations and queer studies. She says that the critical silence on the bisexual significations of the female vampire seems all the more curious given how explicitly the vampire herself articulates bisexual desire. She offers a bisexual reading of these vampire characters by analysing how their traditional features invoke specifically bisexual stereotypes. They have indiscriminate tastes for both fair virgins and unsuspecting males. Anyone warm-blooded will do. They represent the hidden threat, the double agent, the invisibility of the queer desire hidden behind her deceptively femme exterior. As liminal beings, vampires are coded as bisexual. They're scary because they're in between. They're between life and death. They're non-monogamous and they defy the gender binary, both with their androgyny and their genderless desires. They're also often portrayed as being between human and animalistic, both in their changing form and their wild desires and appetites. Associated in legend with hematophagus bats, vampires are repeatedly represented through imagery of wild animals, depicting them as non-human and enslaved by their instinctual urges, much as bisexuals are characterized as predatory and undiscerning in their appetite for sexual partners. A lot of these films, including the more artsy ones, use highly stylized intercutting of animal shots, lab monkeys, cats, scorpions, bats, during scenes of vampires preying on their victims. One such film is The Hunger, an early 80s Hollywood revamp of the 70s European sexploitation films. Sarah has a boyfriend, but becomes quickly infatuated with Miriam. It was later revealed that the director had intended for Sarah's seduction to be non-consensual, but Susan Sarandon, bi icon as she has come to be, thought it would be far more interesting if Sarah consented. As a result, Sarah has a great deal more agency than perhaps any other bisexual victim of the lesbian vampire. The film ends with Sarah having taken Miriam's place, now apparently with two partners of her own, a man and a woman. The Hunger is an early example of a scientific explanation for vampirism in which the vampire blood which transforms Miriam's lovers is a literal infection which can be analysed under a microscope. The Hunger isn't different just because of its higher budget and big name actors, it's also marked by being made in the 80s, a time for change in the public perception of same-sex attraction. The AIDS epidemic had begun and it had a strong association, to say the least, with gay people. And although to the general heterosexual population this was something they didn't have to worry about because it was focused on gay men, AIDS was rousing a new kind of suspicion of bi women. The AIDS epidemic made bisexual women specifically a target of suspicion in the lesbian community, where fear of contaminated fluid and women who come into contact with fluid motivated a safer sex edict against intermingling. The 1992 adaptation of Dracula, featuring apparently slightly bisexual versions of victims Lucy and Mina, again draws attention to the idea of blood as a source of viral transmission. Director Francis Ford Coppola said, "Blood is the primary metaphor. In Nosferatu, Murnau saw the connection between the vampire's diseased blood and plague. People today may see, as we did, the connection with AIDS." As the general public came to better understand how HIV was transmitted, our perception of blood and the danger and the taboo around it began to change also. To this day, we live in a world where the threat of the vampire has some different connotations than it did once upon a time. My bisexual appropriation of the vampire is by no means exclusionary, given that she can be read as embodying cultural myths about nearly any category of other. Like every eroticized celluloid spectacle, the vampire is an icon, a fetish, an image made up to represent what we desire and fear, yet ultimately only screen deep. It is not so much the vampire herself who has changed as the various modes of reading her, influenced by shifting cultural anxieties throughout the past century. A lesbian and a bisexual reading of the vampire are not mutually exclusive. They're complementary and can give us a wider picture. The lesbian reading can illuminate the threat of feminism and female same-sex desire, but without an additional bisexual reading, it's just incomplete. These characters aren't meant to be queer representation in the modern sense. They're not really made with a queer audience in mind. They instead reflect what their contemporary artists and audiences saw as scary, provocative, sexy. It reflects cultural desires and anxieties, not modern identity politics. By only reading them through a lesbian lens instead of a lesbian and bisexual lens, we're missing a big portion of what these films are saying. By the turn of the century, the lesbian vampire became a standard. Sexy female vampires would often make out with each other for no apparent reason except that it was hot, even when the dynamic of the bisexual love triangle wasn't there. The trope was becoming overused, to the point where parodies and subversions of it started to emerge, such as the 2009 film Lesbian Vampire Killers, starring James Corden. Lesbian Vampire Killers is about a guy who gets dumped by his girlfriend, but luckily the now ex-girlfriend turns into a vampire, so he has an excuse to violently murder her. Then they get to violently murder a bunch of other lesbian vampires, and in the end he gets a heterosexual virgin for his new girlfriend. Of course, this is only after they destroy the lesbian vampire queen, who is of course Carmilla, with a peen sword.
Grow up! The handle draws on the power of the demon Diogo.
It's some sword with a metal on the end can save the world? Will you just admit it does look like a...
I can't honestly say how self-aware this film is in terms of how it caters to straight men's anxieties about women's sexuality, but it's definitely about as illustrative of them as the original Carmilla, probably more so, actually. It really strips back the BS and is just like straight up, we like looking at naked lesbians, but we really would like a virgin straight girl in the end. But more recently, a lot of media has made an effort to actively subvert the lesbian vampire trope rather than simply parody it. Jennifer's Body is not technically a vampire film, but it's made by women and clearly references the previous 70 years of man-eating girl monsters, turning the trope into a story about teenage bisexuality, revenge, and questioning who's the real monster. Bit, directed by Brad Michael Elmore, is a 2019 vampire film about a trans lesbian who becomes a vampire, joining a cool lesbian vampire girl gang. On the surface, this sounds really awesome, and I was super excited to watch this film and see how it subverts the genre and utilizes a trans woman in the context of what has historically been a sort of feminist battleground. Unfortunately, Laurel's transness doesn't really come up, despite the fact that the director apparently did, quote, tons of research about trans women for it. A few lines here and there imply to any audience member in the know that this character is trans, but you could easily watch the film and just miss it entirely.
Never, ever turn a man.
What about me?
Never crossed my mind.
Feminism does come into play though. This lesbian vampire girl gang is a strictly no boys allowed club. Though morally dubious, they sometimes kill male abusers, including misogynist Reddit troll vampire hunters. The gang leader Duke is a survivor, an experience which taught her that no man can be trusted with power, in particular the power of vampirism, because power in the hands of a man will always be corrupt. Unfortunately, it turns out Duke is just as corrupt as any man and has been using mind control on her fellow vampires. Laurel's BFF pays the price for her neglect, and she learns that leaving behind the good men in your life is just as bad as if it were done to women. The men are bad, women are good narrative is shattered, and Laurel ends up breaking the vampire rule by saving her brother and turning him into a vampire and imprisoning Duke. The film closes on a discussion about how men aren't inherently corrupt. Evil is not inherent or predetermined. Each individual has to make an effort to be a good person. Manhood and womanhood are morally neutral on their own, and neither side wins. The Reddit vampire killers are destroyed, the creepy male vampire master is defeated, but so is the morally corrupt woman. BIT has moved on from the cultural anxieties surrounding the feminism of the 1970s, but instead draws from cultural anxieties surrounding the feminism of the 2010s. In both instances, the anxieties men have regarding their place in women's worlds. Women have this secret power that could flip the hierarchy on its head, and they're not willing to share it with men. BIT sheds the sexploitation of its predecessors while avoiding subversion of it, and nevertheless inherits the fear of what might happen to men if feminism goes too far. #NotAllMen. If Duke is analogous to Carmilla, the two characters differ in that Duke at least gets to be somewhat sympathetic and gets a backstory. She doesn't have to be killed at the end, only imprisoned, and the rest of the vampires live on to become good lesbian vampires who let the boys into the club. Carmilla the web series is another attempt at subverting the genre, one I have to mention because this is YouTube, and if I don't, this is all the comment section will be about. The Carmilla web series is kind of if Buffy was told entirely through someone's webcam on a desktop computer. This Carmilla is a PG-13 adventure with a way cool college girlfriend version of Carmilla. Set in present-day Austria, everyone is randomly American and speaks exclusively English. The web series doesn't really engage with the history of homophobia inherent in this trope. In fact, in Carmilla, homophobia doesn't even really seem to exist. In this version of Carmilla, Laura and Carmilla are for the most part, happy young couple very much in love. Carmilla is distinctly made for an audience who wants representation, who has been denied these kinds of stories about vampires for years. It doesn't really engage with the history of the genre or follow the source material too closely, but it's a fun lesbian romp that just happens to include vampires in a way more closely derived from the contemporary urban fantasy genre than the past century of lesbian vampire film. There is, however, a recent film that continues the tradition and the trend of subverting the genre. Carmilla, directed by Emily Harris, released in 2019, is a reimagining of the novella through a 21st century lens. We know now the cultural anxiety same-sex attraction inspired in the sexually repressed Victorian era. This film wonders, what sort of real-world events could inspire a short story such as Carmilla? Lara is a lonely girl trapped with her emotionally absent father and a cruel, superstitious governess who regularly binds Lara's left hand and makes her train to use her right hand. Left-handedness throughout history has often been considered something undesirable, if not downright evil, making it an apt metaphor for Lara's blossoming sexuality, which the governess also attempts to repress. They live in the middle of nowhere. Lara's entire world consists of her house and her garden, and what she wants more than anything in the world is a friend. Then one day, a carriage crashes nearby, and an injured girl, Carmilla, must stay at her house to recover. The girls get close, and it's through the governess's deeply religious, superstitious and homophobic lens that she interprets Carmilla's love or desire for Lara as supernatural and monstrous. It's never entirely clear whether the supernatural elements of this film are real or imagined. The 1960 film Blood and Roses had a similar concept. Is this really magic or just superstitious interpretation of real events? But where Blood and Roses blames Carmilla's villainy on her own mental health, Emily Harris's Carmilla suffers from the homophobia of normal people and the anxieties surrounding women's desire. This film is possibly the best subversion of the lesbian vampire genre I've ever seen, despite its rather horrifying ending. The film even subverts the use of animal imagery from the older vampire films to symbolize animalistic desires and predatory nature. It shows these unsettling shots of bugs, worms, and birds with amplified audio of crunching leaves and decaying foliage that creates a beautiful, unsettling effect. But mostly they're just regular garden animals that live around Lara's house. They only seem weird because they're recorded from unusual angles and because the shots represent the less glamorous parts of the garden, bugs, natural decay. They're not actually weird or dangerous, they just reflect our own fears. They're also not exotic big wild animals, they're animals on Laura's estate. The danger is not external, it comes from within the home. This film puts a mirror to us, and unlike the traditional vampire myth, there is a reflection, and it's not a pretty one. It's been a long journey from Carmilla to more Carmilla. The lesbian vampire trope began as a homophobic attempt to exploit the titillation of women's same-sex desire for men while demonizing that behavior for bi women and lesbians. This exploitation trope isn't dead, but as women take the reins of media and are allowed the opportunity to comment on and subvert anxieties about the dangers of feminism, the lesbian vampire and her bisexual sisters have ample room to become true feminist symbols in their own right. And to be honest, for many LGBT people, we already kind of reclaim vampires and make them into our icons. Sexploitation engages mainstream viewers, i.e. straight men, along with image-starved queer spectators who produce fan cults to embrace female vampires. Such fandom is often forged in defiance of criticism by the gay press and the misogyny and homophobia legible in the text. Fans choose instead to read these images as celebrations of female power and same-sex desire. Vampires represent the outcast in us, a person rejected based on their sexuality, sometimes finding their own little community despite what the world thinks of them. Over a century of demonizing these figures while using them as stand-ins for folk like us has meant that we actually have recognized ourselves. And while society has moved on, we've found our strength and our power, we're now able to say, you know what? These characters belong to us. Thank you to all my Vamp patrons, and a special thanks to Kat R, Danny Aidenstone, Siobhan, Aaron, AJ, Apathetic Gaiety, Eric Parkinson, Charis Edwards, Dweebin, ES, Gavin Salmon, Gay Steve, Jamie, Juicy Fantasy Queen Plant Hookups, Jules, Julius, Kiki, Lord Asriel, Marla, Nico, Nick Snari, Nina, Oddbjorn the Frizzy, Olive, Pregnant Seinfeld, Ravarab, Rebecca Peacock, Rock the Shell, Sarah R, Savrad Musin, Soya Donk, Shaved Headed By, Soy, Spencer, Strawfox, Susie S, Talon, Tina Gigya, and Will O'Connor. Please like and subscribe and ring the bell. And if you'd like me to drain your blood and give you everlasting life, please support my Patreon. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next time. I can't actually give you everlasting life, so please support my Patreon.